The first time my new daughter-in-law Madison put her hands on me was at her own wedding. She did it right there in the front row, in a grand Newport mansion my late husband and I once danced in, with 100 pairs of eyes watching me. And my son, Kevin, he just stood there beside his bride and watched it happen. The whispers started almost immediately, a cruel little hiss that spread through the guests like a cold draft. She leaned in close, her Vera Wang dress rustling like dry leaves, and her smile was as brittle as glass. "Eleanor," she whispered, her voice sharp, "this seat is for a special guest. You'll have a wonderful view from the third row." Her words were a slap in the face, meant to put me in my place, to show everyone in that room that I was no longer important. The guests held their breath, waiting to see what the old widow would do. They expected me to shrink, to cry, maybe even to leave. But I looked up at her, at this beautiful, cruel girl who had captured my son's soul, and I did something she never, ever expected. I smiled, and I knew, right then, that she had no idea what a terrible mistake she had just made. My smile seemed to unnerve her more than any angry words could have. Madison, my son's new wife, expected a fight, but she didn't know how to handle my calm. Her pretty face tightened, the skin around her eyes going taut. She was a hunter who had cornered her prey only to find the little rabbit had teeth. She leaned in again, her perfume so strong it almost choked me, and this time there was no pretense of kindness in her voice. "Did you hear me?" she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "I need you to move. Now." That's when she did it. Her manicured fingers, with a diamond big enough to choke a horse, dug into the fabric on my arm. She was actually going to force me out of the chair. My son, Kevin, shifted his weight, his face pale and sick, but he said nothing. He just let her do it. I looked down at her hand on my arm, then back at her furious eyes. I covered her hand with my own, my skin papery against her smooth young flesh. "Honey," I said, my voice clear and loud enough for the whole front row to hear, "the mother of the groom always sits here. It's tradition." I gave her hand a firm little pat and then let go. She backed away, her face like a thundercloud, whispering furiously to my son. I had won the battle over the chair, but I knew, right then and there, that she would make me pay for it. And I wondered if her next attack would be one I couldn't block. As the ceremony started, a hollow ache spread through my chest. My fingers instinctively found the sapphire brooch pinned to my suit. It was the last gift my late husband Richard ever gave me. I remembered that night so clearly, him clasping it for me in our quiet living room. "A symbol of our true blue legacy, Eleanor," he'd said, his voice warm. The brooch was more than just a jewel. It was a promise, a history, a piece of my very heart that I wore on the outside. And now I felt a new chill as I remembered something from the rehearsal dinner just last night. Madison had walked up to me by the dessert table. "That old thing," she'd said, pointing a finger at my brooch. "It's a bit dated, don't you think? I have a lovely diamond necklace for you to wear instead." At the time, I brushed it off. I thought she was just being thoughtless, a young girl with no taste who thought bigger meant better. But now, sitting in that chair she tried to take from me, I saw the truth. This was a pattern. It was a methodical campaign to diminish me, to replace my history with her flashy, hollow present. This was never about a seat or a piece of jewellery. This was about erasure. And I had to wonder, what part of my life would she try to erase next? My son, Kevin, came to me then with Madison on his arm. It was clear this was her idea. My son is not a cruel boy, but he is a weak one. He looked at the floor, at the ceiling, anywhere but at my face. His new wife, however, stared right at me, her eyes glittering. This was her next move, her next little test to see if she could break me. "Eleanor," Madison said, her voice full of fake concern. "The photographer is saying the sapphire is reflecting the light oddly. It could ruin the pictures." I looked down at the beautiful blue stone, my Richard's last gift to me. It wasn't glinting at all. It was a lie, a thin excuse to chip another piece of me away. Then my son, my own boy, spoke. "Please, Mom," Kevin mumbled, his voice barely a whisper. "Madison is worried about the photos, just for the ceremony." His words hurt more than any shove. He was asking me to put away the symbol of his father's love for a photograph for a woman he'd known for barely 2 years. I looked at my son's pleading face, then at Madison's triumphant smirk. She thought she had me trapped. She was attacking the memory of his father, using him as the weapon. My heart felt like a block of ice in my chest. What do you do when your own child asks you to break your own heart? In that moment, everything became clear. This wasn't about a shiny brooch or a reflection in a camera. This was a loyalty test, and I was the final exam. Madison needed to prove to herself and to everyone watching that she now owned my son's heart completely. She needed him to choose her over his own mother, over the memory of the man who raised him. If I refused, I would be the difficult old woman causing a scene at my son's wedding. If I agreed, I would be signaling to her and to him that I was willing to be erased. She thought she had me in checkmate. She even leaned in and whispered so only I could hear, "It's for the best, Eleanor. We want everything to be fresh." That one word, fresh, told me everything. It meant wiping away the past. It meant wiping away Richard. It meant wiping away me. The pain of it was sharp, but with it came a strange kind of strength. I finally saw my enemy for who she truly was. My son was a pawn in her game, but Madison was the queen. I knew I couldn't surrender my husband's memory, but I couldn't fight them either, so I did something else entirely. I looked past them and smiled at the wedding planner, a sharp woman named Nicole, and gave her a tiny, almost invisible nod. What was my signal for? Even Madison had no idea. Nicole, the wedding planner, moved like a shadow. She was a professional, a woman who understood power because she organized parties for the most powerful people in the country. Within seconds, she was at my side, holding a beautiful, soft pashmina of the same deep blue as the sapphire in my brooch. I turned to my son and his wife. "You're right, we can't have that," I said, my voice as sweet as honey, as if I were agreeing with them completely. Before Madison could object, Nicole artfully draped the shawl over my shoulders, partially covering the brooch without hiding it completely. "A quick fix, Madison," Nicole said, her voice crisp and final. Mrs. Vance was just feeling a slight chill anyway. Madison was stunned into silence. She was completely outplayed. How could she argue against me feeling cold? How could she demand I take off a wrap without looking like an absolute monster? My son Kevin just looked relieved, thinking his mother had cooperated and a crisis had been avoided. He didn't see the silent victory that had just taken place. He didn't understand that I had been preparing for this war all along. Madison's eyes were like chips of ice. She knew she had lost this round, and I had a terrible feeling that she would make sure the next battle was one I wasn't prepared for. What could she possibly do that was worse than this? After the business with the brooch, the ceremony finished. I watched my son Kevin kiss his new wife, Madison, and a part of me felt like I was watching a stranger. As guests moved from the garden to the grand ballroom for the reception, I stepped into a quiet hallway to catch my breath. That's when I heard her voice light and bubbly, coming from an open doorway. Madison was on the phone, and from her tone, I knew she was talking to her father. "Daddy, it's perfect, right?" she chirped. "I told you we had it covered. We're just so happy we could give you and Mum this amazing day." Her words hung in the air, cold and sharp. Give you this day? I was the one who had spent hours with the caterers. I was the one who had written the checks, tapping into the money my Richard had worked his entire life for. I knew for a fact that Madison had a mountain of student debt and Kevin's trust fund was still firmly under my control. Her words made no sense. My mind started racing. I looked out a window and saw her father, a good man named Bob Miller, laughing on the lawn. He looked so happy, so proud of his daughter. And a cold, terrible thought began to form in my mind. Did that poor man have any idea what was really going on? I knew I had to find out. I straightened the pashmina on my shoulders and walked out onto the terrace, finding Bob Miller near the champagne fountain. He was a kind man, The sort who ran a local hardware store for 40 years and knew every customer by name. His suit was neatly pressed but not expensive, and his eyes were full of a genuine, tearful joy. "Eleanor," he said, shaking my hand warmly, "your son is a lucky man. Just look at this place." He gestured to the mansion, the orchestra, the waiters in their tuxedos. He looked at his daughter, Madison, across the lawn. And my Madison, to think she could pull all this off. "A Newport wedding," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's more than I ever dreamed for her." The confirmation hit me like a physical blow. He truly believed his daughter, his little girl, was the one who had paid for this multi-million-dollar affair. I felt a wave of pity for him, a good man being used as a prop in his own daughter's show. I simply nodded and said, "She is a very determined young woman." I excused myself then, my heart heavy for this man. The lie was so much bigger and crueler than I had imagined. It made me wonder, how deep did this deception go? And was there anyone else I could trust to see the truth? There was one person, Nicole, the wedding planner. I had hired her not just for her taste, but for her discretion. I found her near the ballroom entrance, clipboard in hand, a fortress of calm in the middle of the storm. I pulled her aside into a small office. "Everything is settled, I trust?" I asked, which was our code for, "Is my money safe and are you still on my side?" "Everything is fully paid, Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice low. "All charges were directed to your private bank as instructed." I took a deep breath. "And were there any other requests for financial statements? From Madison, perhaps?" Nicole's eyes flickered for a second, the only sign of trouble. "She asked for a final itemized budget to show her father," Nicole admitted quietly. "I informed her the documents were sealed with the estate's financial advisors." So there it was, proof. Madison wasn't just telling a story, she was actively trying to create a fake paper trail to make her fantasy real. My planner had blocked her, but it was a chilling thought. Madison was more desperate than I had realized. She was building a house of cards on my foundation, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she tried to kick me out of my own house. The question was no longer if she would be exposed, but how many people she would hurt when her fantasy world came crashing down. It all clicked into place when I saw Madison holding court on the veranda with a group of people from her hometown in Pennsylvania. They were simple, hard-working folks, looking out of place in their Sunday best. She was telling them a grand story, gesturing at the string quartet. "It's just so wonderful to finally be in a position to give our families the best," she said, her voice dripping with fake humility. "We wanted to show everyone back home what's possible." That's when the full, chilling truth hit me. This wasn't just a little lie to impress her father. This was a massive, calculated fraud designed to rewrite her entire life story. She was using my money to create a myth, to rebrand her humble family as a wealthy dynasty. She was positioning herself as the hometown girl who made it big, the grand benefactor. My money, my husband Richard's legacy, was being used as a stage prop in the most dishonest play I had ever seen. The final toast, I realized, was no longer just about defending my own honor. It was about stopping a lie so big it was poisoning everyone, especially the good people who loved her the most. My heart ached because I knew the truth would not only humiliate her, it would break their hearts. The cracks in Madison's perfect facade began to show a little while later. I saw her mother, a sweet woman named Mary, standing by the huge seafood tower. She looked at the giant shrimp and oysters with the wide-eyed wonder of a child. She carefully put a few onto a small plate. Madison swept over to her, her smile gone, replaced by a tight, angry line. "Mother," she whispered harshly, "those are for the more important guests. Don't look so common." Mary's face fell. The light in her eyes just went out. She put the plate down immediately, her hands trembling as she smoothed the front of her simple dress. She looked ashamed. I saw the whole exchange and my heart went out to her. Madison's cruelty wasn't just for me. It was for anyone who reminded her of where she came from. She was so desperate to become someone else that she was willing to crush her own mother to do it. Mary caught my eye from across the room, and for a split second, I saw a look of such deep, silent pain pass between us. It was the look of a mother who knows she is losing her child, and I had a terrible feeling that she and I had far more in common than either of us knew. I had to talk to my son. I found him alone for a moment near the bar, and I put a gentle hand on his arm. "Kevin," I said softly, "are you happy? Truly?" He wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at a glass of champagne, swirling it around and around. "Of course I am, Mom," he said, but his voice was hollow. "Madison is incredible. We're building a new life, a better life." It sounded rehearsed, like a line she had fed him. I tried again. "Your father would have wanted you to build a life on truth, honey." At the mention of his father, a flicker of anger crossed his face. "Madison says we shouldn't live in the past," he said, his voice cold. "She says we have to create our own legacy." Then he looked at me, his eyes empty of the warmth I remembered. "And she's right. It's our time now." He turned and walked away, leaving me standing there with my hand outstretched. He had chosen his side. He had chosen the lie. And for the first time that day, standing alone in that crowded, noisy ballroom, I felt a tear finally escape and trace a cold path down my cheek. I had lost my son. I had to get away. I found a small, quiet sitting room just off the main ballroom, the music a dull thud through the thick oak doors. I sank into a velvet chair, feeling the full weight of my 68 years. I was so tired. A moment later, the door opened and Mary, Madison's mother, slipped inside. She looked just as lost as I felt. We didn't say anything for a long time. We just sat there, two mothers on opposite sides of a silent war, listening to the muffled sounds of a party that felt like a funeral. Finally, she spoke, her voice so soft I could barely hear it. "She was always ambitious," Mary said, staring at a pattern on the Persian rug. It was the biggest understatement I had ever heard, but I knew what it cost her to say it. I reached over and put my hand on her arm. "You raised a good daughter, Mary," I told her, and I meant it. "The girl I met a few years ago was kind. This is something new." She gave me a watery smile, a look of such profound sadness and gratitude. We didn't need to say anything else. In that quiet room, a silent understanding was formed. I wasn't just fighting for my husband's legacy anymore. I was fighting for the good, simple people my daughter-in-law was willing to destroy to get what she wanted. When I returned to the ballroom, Madison was at the microphone, holding a glass of champagne. She was glowing, basking in the attention of the crowd. My son, Kevin, stood beside her, looking at her as if she were the sun itself. "I just want to thank my incredible family," Madison said, her voice ringing with false emotion, "for their unbelievable support in making this dream a reality." She smiled at her parents, who looked on with tearful, innocent pride. "Kevin and I are so excited to build our future from the ground up, and this is the perfect start." Every word was a perfectly crafted lie. She made it sound like they were a hard-working young couple who had earned all of this themselves. Then she turned and looked directly at me. "And thank you to Eleanor," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, "for welcoming me into the family so warmly." The room erupted in applause. It was a masterful performance. She had publicly painted me as the supportive, happy mother-in-law, trapping me in my role. She raised her glass, her eyes locked on mine in a look of pure, cold triumph. The message was clear. I have won. He is mine. All of this is mine. And in that moment, I believe she really thought it was true. As the applause for Madison died down, a heavy weight settled on my shoulders. I watched her laughing, watched my son kiss her cheek, watched her poor father wipe a tear from his eye. The truth felt like a heavy stone in my gut. My brother-in-law, David, was scheduled to give the final toast. He knew everything. We had prepared for this. But now, seeing the wreckage it would cause, I hesitated. What would my Richard have done? He was a man of truth, yes, but he was a man of kindness above all. Would he want me to bring this much shame and pain down on another family, even if they were in the wrong? For a split second, I thought about letting it go. I could just let David give a simple, happy toast. We could all pretend. I could walk away from this gilded cage and leave them to their hollow victory. Maybe that was the stronger thing to do. The MC stepped up to the microphone, his voice booming. And now, for the final toast of the evening. He was about to call David's name. I caught David's eye across the room. He was waiting for my signal. A nod from me meant he would tell the whole devastating truth. A slight shake of my head meant he would just wish them well. The entire future of everyone in that room rested on what I did in the next 2 seconds. I stood there frozen, with the future of everyone in that room held in my hands. The MC was smiling, waiting to introduce my brother-in-law, David. David was watching me from across the room, his eyes asking the silent question. For a moment, I saw my son Kevin's face in the crowd. He was looking at his new wife, Madison, with such complete blind love. Maybe I should just let him have that, I thought. Maybe a happy lie is better than a miserable truth. But then, as if she could feel my hesitation, Madison looked over at me. She saw me watching them, and a tiny, triumphant smirk played on her lips. It was a look of pure ownership. A look that said, "He belongs to me now, and everything you are will be forgotten." That's what did it. It wasn't about anger anymore. It was about honor. It was about the memory of my husband, Richard, and the truth he lived by. I would not let his legacy be built on a foundation of lies and disrespect. I took a slow breath, met David's waiting gaze, and gave him a single firm nod. The wheels were in motion. There was no going back now. But just as he took his first step toward the stage, a hand gripped my arm, startling me. It was Kevin. My son's face was a tight mask of anger. He had seen my nod to his uncle. He knew. "Mum, don't," he whispered, his voice low and urgent, his fingers digging into my arm. "Whatever you're planning with Uncle David, just don't do it." I looked at him, my own child, and felt a piece of my heart break. "Kevin," I started, "this is about the truth." "No," he cut me off, his voice shaking. "It's about you trying to ruin my wedding. Madison warned me you'd pull something like this." His words felt like stones being thrown at me. "She said you couldn't stand to see me happy with someone else." It was her voice coming out of his mouth. Her poison. Her paranoia. He was looking at me not as his mother, but as the enemy his wife had told him I was. He let go of my arm, and his final words shattered what was left of my composure. "If you do this," he whispered, his voice breaking with a terrible finality, "don't ever speak to me again." He turned his back on me and walked back to his bride, leaving me utterly alone in the middle of the crowd. And up on the stage, the MC was smiling, saying, "Please welcome Mr. David Vance." I watched my brother-in-law, David, walk toward that stage in a daze. My son's threat echoed in my ears. As David passed the head table, he looked so much like his brother, my late Richard. He had the same determined set to his jaw, the same kind eyes that could turn to steel when defending his family. I remembered standing by Richard's bed in the hospital in those final quiet days. David had been there holding his brother's hand. "David, look after her," Richard had whispered, his voice weak. "Protect our legacy. Don't let anyone tarnish it." I remembered David's answer as he squeezed his brother's hand. "Always, brother. I promise." Now, here he was, about to keep that promise. This wasn't my revenge. It was his sacred duty. He was doing this for his brother. He reached the microphone. The small sound of him adjusting it echoed through the silent, expectant room. He looked out at the crowd, his eyes passing over my son and his bride, over her shocked parents, and finally, they met mine. His expression was full of sorrow for the pain I had just endured, but also a firm, unbreakable resolve. He took a deep breath and began to speak. My brother-in-law, David, stood at that microphone, and a hush fell over the room. My daughter-in-law, Madison, looked pleased with herself, thinking the last obstacle, my son, had been dealt with. She expected a short, boring speech. David smiled, a calm, gentle smile that did not reach his eyes. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice warm and steady. "On a day like this, we celebrate love and the joining of families. It makes me think of a story my brother Richard, Kevin's father, once told me." I saw Madison relax a little, probably thinking he was just a rambling old man. "He told me about a good man," David continued, "a proud hardware store owner from a small town in Pennsylvania who was about to lose everything he had ever worked for. A big box store had moved in, and he was on the verge of bankruptcy." The story seemed so random, so out of place. The guests looked a little confused. My son Kevin was frowning, wondering where this was going, but I held my breath. I knew this story. It was the story of my husband's character, of his quiet goodness. David paused, letting the words hang in the air. Madison was looking bored. She had no idea that the story was about her, but I had a feeling her father was just beginning to understand. I watched Madison's father, Bob Miller, as David spoke. At the mention of a hardware store in Pennsylvania, his friendly smile faltered. A look of confusion crossed his face. He was a man who had lived that exact nightmare. David kept going, his voice never changing. "This good man was too proud to ask for help," he said. "But my brother, Richard, heard about his struggle through a mutual friend, and he decided to make an anonymous investment to save that store." That's when I saw it. The colour drained from Bob Miller's face. His hand holding a champagne glass began to tremble. This wasn't just any story. It was his story. I glanced at Madison. Her smugness was gone. A flicker of panic was in her eyes. She was smart enough to see where this was going. She shot a desperate, panicked look at her father, whose face was now ashen white. He knew. He was the man in the story. And then, I saw her turn and look at me, her eyes wide with pure animal terror. She finally understood what was happening, and she knew there was absolutely nothing she could do to stop it. The air in the ballroom was thick and heavy. The guests were completely silent now, sensing the invisible drama that was playing out. They didn't know the names, but they could feel the tension, sharp and dangerous. Madison was frozen in her chair, a porcelain doll with cracks spreading all over her face. My brother-in-law, David, continued as if he noticed nothing. His voice was the only sound in the vast, silent room. "My brother Richard never wanted any credit," he said, looking around the room. "He believed that a legacy isn't what you keep, but what you give. He believed that true wealth is lifting others up, quietly and without fanfare. It was a principle he lived by, and a value he passed on." Every word was a tribute to my husband and a quiet judgment on Madison's loud, greedy ambition. David had laid all the pieces out for everyone to see. He had honoured his brother's character and exposed the lack of it in others, all without raising his voice. The power in the room had shifted completely. Madison was no longer the queen on her throne. She was a defendant in a silent courtroom. The only thing left to do was to name the names. David paused, raised his glass a little higher, and opened his mouth to deliver the final devastating blow. My brother-in-law David stood there with his glass held high, the entire room hanging on his next word. He had told them a story about two men, an unnamed hero and a man on the verge of ruin. Madison was pale, her eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. David's calm voice cut through the silence. "That anonymous investor," he said, his voice clear and strong, "the man who saved that little hardware store, was my brother, Richard Vance." A collective gasp went through the room. The Vance family name was well known. My husband had been a titan of quiet integrity. Then David turned his gaze, full of a sad sort of kindness, to Madison's father. "And that good, proud man he helped all those years ago," David said, his voice softening, "was none other than the father of the bride, Bob Miller." The whispers erupted. People turned to stare at Bob, who put his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with an emotion I couldn't quite read. Madison looked like she had seen a ghost. The story was no longer a story. It was a public record. But David wasn't finished. He looked at the shocked faces of the guests. "But that," he said, his voice growing stronger, "is only the first part of the story. Because Richard's legacy of generosity did not die with him." Every eye in the room was now locked on David. My son Kevin looked utterly lost, a boy caught in a storm he didn't understand. "Richard's wife, Eleanor," David continued, gesturing toward me with his glass, "lives that legacy every single day. So when it came time for this beautiful wedding, as a tribute to the husband she adored, and as a gift to the new couple, Eleanor insisted on funding it all. Every flower, every plate, every drop of champagne in your glasses." If the room was whispering before, it was a roar of murmurs now. People were turning in their seats to stare at me, then at Madison, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning understanding. This time I saw my son's head snap up. He stared at me, his mouth hanging slightly open, the puzzle pieces of Madison's wild spending and her strange hostility toward me finally clicking into place in his mind with horrible clarity. Madison was no longer looking at anyone. She was just staring at the tablecloth, her face a blank white mask. She looked like a statue. But the worst part, the part that would truly destroy her, was yet to come, because David was about to tell them not just what I did, but what she had done. David let the murmurs die down. His voice, when he spoke again, was somber, full of a deep disappointment that was more cutting than any anger could be. "Eleanor asked for nothing in return for this gift," he said, and I could tell he was speaking directly to my son now. A family's happiness was her only goal. "But it is a sad thing," he said, his eyes finally moving to land on Madison, "to see such quiet generosity twisted into a loud and public lie. It is a sad thing to watch someone take credit for a gift they did not earn." That was it. That was the kill shot. He didn't just say I paid, he said Madison had lied about it. He exposed the active, ugly deception. He took away any chance she had to explain this away as some kind of misunderstanding. The guests' faces hardened. They were no longer just shocked, they were disgusted. They were looking at my new daughter-in-law, not as a lucky girl who received a wonderful gift, but as a thief who had tried to steal my family's honor. He let his words hang in the silence for a moment, then he raised his glass high. "So tonight, let us give thanks where it is truly due," he declared. But what would he say next? Would he toast to me? Or would he finish this humiliation completely? My brother-in-law David held that champagne flute high, and every eye was on him. Madison looked like a trapped animal, while my son Kevin just looked broken. David's voice rang out, filled not with anger, but with a deep, solemn power. "So I ask you all to join me in raising your glass," he declared, "not to a new marriage built on a foundation of lies." A collective gasp rippled through the room at such a direct, shocking statement. "But to the enduring legacy of a good man, my brother Richard Vance," David continued, his voice steady, "and to the quiet strength of the woman who is its heart." He turned then and looked directly at me, and for the first time that night, I did not feel alone. "To Eleanor," he said simply. One by one, the guests rose to their feet, not with the happy cheers of a normal wedding, but with a quiet, somber respect. They raised their glasses with me. It was the quietest, saddest toast I had ever witnessed. The speech was over. The truth was out. And I looked at my son's table to finally see the full extent of the damage. After the toast, the silence in that grand ballroom was the loudest sound I had ever heard. The orchestra didn't start playing again. The waiters stopped pouring wine. Everyone was just still. I looked at the head table, which was supposed to be the center of all the joy. It looked like a shipwreck. My son, Kevin, was staring down at his own hands, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He wouldn't look at me. He wouldn't look at his new wife. Madison was worse. She was sitting perfectly straight, her hands in her lap, her face completely blank and white. She hadn't moved a muscle. But the strangest thing was the two empty chairs beside her. Her parents, Bob and Mary Miller, were gone. They had vanished from the head table during the toast. The beautiful party, the music, the laughter. It had all evaporated. All that was left was a thick, heavy silence and 100 people trying desperately not to stare at the ruins of my family. I felt a surge of regret, wondering if I had gone too far. But then I saw him. Madison's father, Bob Miller, was walking back toward the head table, and his face was a mask of cold, hard judgment. Every whisper stopped when people saw Bob Miller walking across that marble floor. His wife, Mary, trailed a few feet behind him, her face tear-streaked and pale. He didn't look at anyone else. He walked right up to his daughter, Madison, who was still frozen in her chair. He stood before her, a simple, proud man whose pride had just been shattered in front of the whole world. The silence was so complete that I could hear my own heart beating. "Is it true, Madison?" he asked, his voice quiet, but it carried across the room. "All of it?" Madison couldn't speak. She just looked up at her father, her face crumbling, and gave a tiny, pathetic little nod. That was all he needed to see. "We're leaving," he said, his voice flat and dead. "Get your mother's coat." Without another word, he turned his back on her, a father publicly disowning his child's choices, and went to his crying wife. Madison was left there, utterly and completely alone, abandoned by everyone. She slowly looked up from her table, and her eyes, full of a terrifying emptiness, found mine from across the room. What would I see in that look? Would it be hatred, remorse, or something else entirely? In the dead silence of that room, Madison's empty eyes finally met mine. I was braced for anything, for rage, for tears, for a screamed accusation. I saw none of it. What I saw was much, much scarier. Nothing. The lights were on, but nobody was home. The ambitious, fiery girl who had fought me at every turn was just gone. All that was left was a hollow shell. She looked at me for a long moment, and I felt not a flicker of triumph, only a deep and profound sadness for the woman she could have been. Then, with a strange, calm grace, she stood up. She smoothed the front of her perfect white wedding gown. She didn't look at my son, Kevin. She didn't look at her parents, who were now huddled together by the door. She just turned and began to walk. She wasn't running. She walked with a steady, eerie calm right past her own wedding cake, a giant, untouched monument to a life that would never happen. She walked out the grand doors, into the dark Newport night, and disappeared. The Queen had left her throne. And in her place, my son Kevin sat, completely and utterly shattered. What would he do now that his Queen was gone? Every single person in that room turned from the empty doorway to look at my son. He was the last piece of the puzzle. He just sat there for the longest time, staring at the spot where his wife had been. I could see the war inside him. I could see him wrestling with the lies he'd been told and the truth he'd just been shown. My heart ached for him. I didn't move. This had to be his choice. After a lifetime, it felt like. He slowly pushed his chair back. He stood up, his legs unsteady. He didn't look at me. Instead, he walked over to my brother-in-law, David. "Uncle David," Kevin asked, his voice hoarse and broken. Did he really do that for her family?" David put a firm hand on my son's shoulder. "He did, Kevin," he said gently. It was the kind of man he was. My son nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of a truth he had never known. Then, he finally turned and walked toward my table. He stopped in front of me, his eyes full of tears. He didn't say he was sorry. He just looked at me, the real me, his mother, and whispered one word: Mum. Just hearing him say my name in his real voice was enough to break me. I stood up and finally, hugged my son. Was our family truly saved, or just broken in a different way? The next morning, I sat alone on the grand terrace of that empty mansion, a cup of coffee in my hands. The sky was clear and blue, and the ocean was calm. The party was over, the guests were gone. The truth had cost so much. A broken bride, a devastated family, a son who had to rebuild his entire world. It was not a happy ending. But as I sat there, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time: peace. I had not taken joy in Madison's ruin, but I had reclaimed my family's honor. I had protected my Richard's legacy. My son and I had a long road ahead of us, but for the first time in years we were on the same road. As I looked out at the horizon, my phone buzzed on the table beside me. It was a message from my business team, a world away from all this family drama. I picked it up and read the words: "The Singapore merger is approved. Time to build a real legacy." I smiled, a real, genuine smile. The wedding was over. One chapter of my life, a chapter of grief and betrayal, was finally closed. But another one, a chapter that was all my own, was just beginning.